Next meeting, the meeting next month, we'll be talking about surface water dependent ecosystems and how those are affected by groundwater, and that also ties back to groundwater levels. We'll also be talking about water quality, and we're not quite sure yet how that relates. We're working on that piece. But in terms of, then in July, we're going to have a joint meeting with the MGA board to talk about projects, get a little bit more into maybe some of the trends, but talk about things that are of interest to both organizations. So it'll be a good opportunity to get information and also to interact with the larger board. So let's do some introductions. Going around the room, we'll start with Rosemary.
Private Art of the Water Directors of Santa Cruz.
I'm Darcy Pruitt. I'm the senior planner with the Regional Water Management Foundation.
I'm John Lear, and I'm an at-large representative.
Ralph Bracmani, Central Water District.
Marco Romanini, Central Water District Board Member.
Tom Weiner, Cabrillo College, the institutional representative.
John Kennedy, private well owner representative.
Alison Conte, County Santa Cruz.
David Baskin, City of Santa Cruz Water Commission.
John Bargetto, agricultural representative.
Kate Anderton, environmental representative.
Keith Gudger, at-large representative.
Bruce Jaffe, Soco Creek Water District Board Member.
I'm Sierra Ryan, staff at the County of Santa Cruz.
I'm Dana McCarthy, the Water Utility Ratepayer representative.
CC Vu, Kernton West Facilitation Team.
Georgina King, Hydrometrics Technical Consultant.
And Eric Monsley, Kernton West, the Facilitation Team.
And we have few enough folks in the audience, so if you guys don't mind introducing yourself.
I'm Becky Steinbruner. I'm a customer of Pure Source Water Company, a small water company in the Aptos Hills.
Larry Freeman. I'm private consultant, citizen water user, and part of the Soquel Creek Water District. It's a newly renamed Infrastructure and Water Resources Standing Committee.
I'm Amanda Price-Derby. I'm with the California Department of Water Resources. I'm your basin point of contact and the regional coordinator.
All right. Thank you all. You want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Bruce Tanner. I'm a resident of Santa Cruz and a concerned local community member.
Good, thank you. We'll turn it over now to Eric, and we'll go from here.
Okay, so we're going to walk through our objectives and the agenda for tonight. John covered these at a high level. The two main things we want to do tonight, and we're following in some ways on the discussion that began at the last meeting. But we are trying tonight to have discussions around two of the sustainability indicators, the groundwater levels and subsidence. And with each of these, we want to discuss and get advisory committee input on your views on significant unreasonable conditions and also undesirable results, as they will help to inform the definition of the minimum thresholds. So that's the first main objective. The second objective is, at the end of the meeting, we want to get through those first, to loop back onto some of the input that you provided at the last meeting as an advisory committee and reflect on how that has been incorporated into the process and get your views on that, because we want to make sure that we're incorporating that in a way that is transparent and acceptable to you guys as we move forward. And if we need extra time for that, we can continue offline after the meeting ends. So those are the objectives. In terms of the agenda and the rollout, this is going to be a little bit similar to past meetings too. We will start with an oral communications period to address items not on the agenda. Then we'll start with the first of our two sustainability indicators, groundwater levels. We'll spend a chunk of time describing some staff proposals and getting your input on those, and then we'll wrap that up and then have public comment at that period, and hopefully hear some comments from members of the public here on that topic in particular. We'll take a break and we'll come back and do the second of the two sustainability indicators, subsidence. We'll again pause for public comment, and then we'll wrap for the evening by both confirming the meeting summary from last time, but then also looking at the document that was in your packet on how staff incorporated the input from last time, and check in with you on how does that look. because again, we're in the middle of doing a number of these sustainability indicators, and we want to make sure that we're hitting the mark with those. Then we'll wrap up and do next steps. So for the timeline moving forward, John gave a little bit of a heads up here, and you're going to have to look at your packet because these are small on your screen. But again, we're doing the second and third of 6 of the sustainability indicators in terms of getting your input on significant unreasonable conditions and undesirable results. We'll be doing water quality and surface water interactions at the next meeting in June, and then at the July meeting, as John mentioned, we're going to actually do a joint meeting and start talking about projects and how we will be incorporating the information that we've been bringing into that discussion, and we'll also be bringing in some additional trend data that we've been bringing in past meetings. We'll do that again more explicitly at that meeting in July. Just a note here that this document you've seen slightly modified versions, but the next time you see this at the next meeting, we're going to go further into the year past July to make sure that it's clear how the process is envisioned to be moving forward, and we'll be making adjustments as needed based upon how things go in meetings. So before we start up today, there are a couple of updates that we wanted to share that we will think will be of interest and relevance to the advisory committee members. We'll go through these one at a time. And first, I would turn to Sierra to give an update on an upcoming stakeholder meeting.
Yep, so I believe all the committee members got a flyer in front of them. We have a stakeholder meeting coming up on June 14th. It'll be held at the Congregational Church in Soquel. And that meeting, it's open to obviously it's open to the public, and it's intended for really a general audience who maybe haven't been following as closely, but I think it would be really great to have all the advisory committee members there so that you can kind of interact with some of the people that you're representing and hear the kind of questions that they have. We're going to be doing just a kind of a status update on the process. This will be something like the 14th stakeholder meeting that we've done, so we'll be kind of providing an update since the last meeting that we did, as well as talking a little bit about the role of the committee, and then we'll be breaking into kind of interest groups, small breakout session groups where we're going to dive deep into a couple of different topics and really be able to solicit feedback from the public on those, and then at the end we'll kind of reconvene the group and talk about what we learned, and we'll also be able to bring some of the input that we received at that meeting back to this group. So I really encourage you all to attend if you can. It's a Thursday, I believe. It's in the evening from 7 o'clock to 9 o'clock. And yeah, you're more than welcome, and tell your friends, tell your neighbors, try to get everybody to come.
Okay, thanks here. So yeah, so it's actually quite important if possible that we have good representation from the advisory committee. Another update has to do with the development of this trend data that I mentioned before that we will go into more detail in July. But John, I want to turn to you.
I mean, we've been working with Georgina on trying to develop trend data so that we both could look at the history and get some sense of how we got here, and then also be projecting forward. The projecting forward depends a lot on sort of what comes out of our process we're talking about here, so to try to set some of the conditions and the targets as we project forward. But as we look at the history, we've also been grappling with how best to display the information and get the scales in a way that you can compare different trends, like in pumping or population or storage or groundwater levels, be able to overlay those in a way that is meaningful, that they don't get lost in big scale. So we're still working on that. We're still working with the model and trying to figure out how to pull information out of the model that helps to summarize that and display some of this trend data. So kind of taking from John's idea of doing more of a matrix or a table, really going more to some of these trend lines, and I think we shared some of that preliminary information with the group at the last meeting, and that's a continued work in progress. Where so far we've been focusing on the past up to now, but then we'll probably after July we'll be able to start projecting into the future. But a lot of that depends on the targets that you guys set too as we go into the future. So
Okay, so that's a
Continued progress.
heads up to stay tuned.
We'll share it with you as soon as we can, because it's pretty interesting stuff, but we're still trying to get it in a way that it makes sense.
Thanks, John. Next, we've had requests at several of our past meetings from members of the public about whether it's possible to be communicating with individual advisory committee members through more targeted email structure rather than going through Darcy. Do we have an update on that, Darcy?
Yeah, so we've been working on providing individual emails for all of the members of both this committee and the MGA board who don't have an agency email. And those will be rolling out in the next few weeks as we get the policy that supports those email addresses. And the email addresses will basically be first initial, last name, at MGA. And we'll be in touch about that. But that'll be rolling out probably this next month.
Okay, thanks, Darcy. So this is a request that has taken a while, but it's moving forward. David?
So I'm curious, if we use one of those email addresses, does that mean that our emails will then be tracked for purposes of public record keeping?
Yes.
And if we choose not to, can we just have emails to us come through staff?
I think that is part of the policy discussion that we would need to have. And if you have an individual objection, then we can certainly discuss that at a staff level.
It's not so much as an objection as a curiosity and concern. To me, there are issues presented by having members of the public being able to correspond directly with committee members. And especially when you start sending blast emails out to multiple committee members and people start hitting reply to all, it starts to present public meeting issues.
Yeah,
and
I think
it's generally been my preference in the staff when I've been on the Parks Commission and now Water that communications from the public get filtered through staff so that we avoid those problems and staff can distribute them with appropriate instructions for how we might handle them if that's appropriate.
Well, it sounds like we're going to have
I think we're going to have some policy discussions that are going to underpin this, but it's in process, and certainly we're going to be listening to the committee members and the board members about their feelings about this.
When you say there's going to be policy discussions, do you mean at a staff level or here at an advisory board level? Should we be having like an ad hoc committee to discuss this? Like, what do you mean when you're saying we're going to be having some policy discussions?
Well, since this was not my item and I'm filling in, I'm not exactly sure how this is going to work. And I think it has a lot to do with the feedback that we get from you. Because we've been listening to the feedback that we've been getting from the public. And of course, I think our first concern, certainly from my perspective, is making sure that our volunteer committee members are comfortable with what's being asked of them.
And one of the things that's holding us up a little bit on the policy is we've been working with the county, who's also developing an email policy, an email retention policy, and we've kind of been waiting for that policy to get firmed up to be able to provide us some guidance as to what we would be proposing essentially for this organization.
But the question is this a policy we're going to decide on, or is it a policy that's going to be imposed upon us?
I think it's one that we're going to recommend, either to you or more likely potentially the board, the MGA board. The MGA board is the ultimate decision maker in all of this. Staff can put something together and make recommendations, but the board ultimately adopts the policy.
It would just seem to me that however that process works, that people at this table will want to have an opportunity to have input into it so that they can, participate in that decision-making process.
Yeah, and we can share that with you guys too, and everybody can get the comments in and go from there.
So, don't recognize that this is taking longer than I think I anticipated, but it's complicated, so we want to make sure we're getting it right along the way.
And I'll make sure we keep you in the loop on where things are so that you can participate in that conversation.
Thanks for that, Darcy. Next update with regard to outreach support. So Sierra.
Yeah. So a lot of the committee members were selected as representatives of certain stakeholder or interest groups, and we've heard from the public that there's some interest in how they can kind of communicate beyond just email addresses, maybe some form of meetings or drop-ins or any number of ways that you'd be interested in communicating. And the county's communication officer, his name is Jason Hoppin, has offered to come to the next committee meeting at the June meeting at 4:30, so the meeting will start at 5. He's going to be here from 4:30 to 5 to make himself available to offer advice or suggestions or recommendations or talk with committee members if they're interested in different ideas, ways that they can maybe be interacting with the groups that they are representing. And he'll also do a little presentation at the beginning of that meeting, and he'll be available for any of you to use as a resource afterwards moving forward. So I wanted to give you this kind of heads up that if you think you're going to want to talk to him, if this is something you've been thinking about, or maybe you haven't been thinking about it yet, now's a good time to start. And come prepared with questions. If you wanted to come early and sit with him, he'd be really happy to help you out. So.
Okay, we'll send out a reminder in advance of the next meeting, so we know a good resource to have. And then finally, last update has to do with field trips. Darcy.
So some people at the last meeting requested some field trip options, and I put together a ballot, and I'm going to be handing out the ballot so that you can kind of vote on the categories of kinds of field trips that you might like to go on. And then I'll collect that before the end of the meeting so that we can kind of put together the field trips based on your greatest interest.
Okay, so don't run too far away during the break, and we'd love to get everybody's feedback and recognize that a couple people are missing, and we'll need to go close the loop with them too. Okay, so that's what we had for intro and updates. Any questions from the advisory committee before we move on? Okay, great. So thanks everybody for that. So we're going to move to our oral communications item, and this one is focused on comments on non-agenda items. And just want to pause for a second before we do this. At our last meeting, we had a number of public comment opportunities, and we received some questions during those public comments that because of our policy in the charter of not getting into a discussion during public comment, that we didn't respond to those, but recognized that that was awkward too, and that if there's timely information that can be provided to a clarifying question, it would be good to do that. And so we've given John Ricker the assignment that if there are questions, clarifying questions that come up during the public comment periods or this oral communications one, that can easily be answered to help clarify how the process is moving. We will try to address those. If it's a longer question that requires more time offline, it'll be moved to during the break or another time. So with that, I'd like to see a show of hands of members of the public who would like to participate in this oral communications period. I see one. Anyone else? Okay, so Becky, if you could come up, give your name and any affiliation, and you have 3 minutes for this, please.
Thank you. My name is Becky Steinbrunner. As I said, I'm a customer of Pure Source Water Company, a small water company up in the hills next to Nisene Mark State Park. I'm also an interested participant in the Water for Santa Cruz County group, from whom you've heard before. They often Mr. Scott McGilvray comes and talks with you. And I guess first of all, I want to thank you for your hard work. You're volunteers, and this is a huge job, and it's a lot to learn, and it's a lot to do, and I want to thank you, most of all. I am happy that there's some action moving along on the email issue. I've asked for that a number of times, and I just feel like it's one less filter for the public to you, and that's why I keep asking for it. So thank you, Ms. Pruitt, for moving along on that. I was excited at the last board meeting, MGA board meeting, to hear Mr. Duncan say that the model looks like it might be ready to look at by November, and I'm hoping that that will happen, because that will give us all some better information for this. I'm a little concerned about what I have understood with the model the county is working on, that involves what would it look like if all the private wells were turned off. Being what's considered by this group a private well user, and given the state's propensity to consolidate. I'm a little worried about that, and so, but I understand that you want to try and get a handle on how much the private well pumpers are really contributing to the groundwater issues. But I also have concerns that the groundwater recharge from the septic is being downplayed. I think that could be a very significant piece in the rural areas, especially if this group works with Dr. Andy Fisher at UCSC, who is doing a lot of work to characterize the best recharge areas in the county. I understand that this group is not about making projects, so I want to make that clear. But I do hope that you will investigate the waterforsantacruz.com website. Mr. Scott McGilvray's group is very thoughtful. They're doing some excellent research to gather historic trends of things using water from the pre-1914 North Coast streams, with great respect to the fish flows. And finally, I want to say that I have tried to listen to the audio recordings when I can't be here, and they're really hard to hear. So my great thanks to Mr. Bruce Tanner for coming and video recording. I think he puts it up on YouTube, and please feel free to use that and pass it out to people you think would be interested. And in closing, I would like to request that your group does incorporate into your discussions the great wealth of information we have here with Amanda and the state. I actually think she should have a place at the table. But again, thank you all very much for your hard work.
Thank you. Any other comments from members of the public? Okay, just to let you know as a side note that we have been talking with DWR about their appropriate role in terms of being at the table or not, and there may be times where we do ask them to come up to participate. So we're being mindful of the appropriateness of that too.
Thank you.
Thanks. Okay. Okay, so we're going to move to the first of our two sustainability indicators for today, lowering of groundwater levels. And here, I'm going to turn it over to Georgina in a second, but just want to sort of frame how this is going to happen for everybody. For those of you who were here last time, should be somewhat familiar in terms of how the process will go. I know we had some people who weren't here at the last meeting. So the way it'll take place is that Georgina will give a presentation of some background information and then staff proposals with a rationale around each topic. And then she'll provide some options, and then we open it up for discussion among the advisory committee members. And before we leave a particular topic, we'll then wrap up and actually go around the room and one at a time we'll hear from each and every one of you about where you landed at that time. So the reality is that each of these different sustainability indicators has one or more topics for significant and unreasonable conditions or for undesirable results. And for seawater intrusion, there were a total of 7 separate topics for just that one sustainability indicator. There are actually fewer this time around, so we actually have more space to have more discussion around this, but it's going to proceed in the same way. And I think for this, for groundwater levels, there's actually only one topic that you'll be weighing in on for significant and unreasonable conditions, and only one that you'll be weighing in on for undesirable results. So this is going to be a lot more straightforward than how we had to break it up into different pieces for seawater intrusion. And when we do subsidence, there are a couple extras in there, but I think better in that way for our ability to have discussion. One last reminder is that if you remember the spiral graphic from last time, we are in the initial design phase here, where we're really trying to find good starting points for significant unreasonable conditions and undesirable results for all of these sustainability indicators, so that staff then can take information from that and develop minimum thresholds that will go into the modeling by which you can then evaluate projects and potential projects. And so here we want to get something that folks feel pretty comfortable with, but want to remind everybody that we're going to be iterating through this, and you'll have several more months add this after, so just to keep that in mind. All right, so after all that preamble, Georgina, I turn it over to you.
Good evening, everyone. Okay, like Eric says, today we're talking about chronic lowering of groundwater levels. And what's important here is that it's chronic lowering of groundwater levels. And we have to identify levels that are really bad. And I'll go through this sustainability indicator. I'm going to give you some background. You know, chronic lowering of groundwater levels happens usually because of something you've done in the basin. Naturally, the groundwater levels go up and down because there's recharge events, there's periods of lower rainfall, so naturally groundwater levels are going to go down. You know, if you have a 10-year drought, it's going to go down. But also we know in this basin that production, or mostly municipal production, has a bigger impact on groundwater levels too. So this chart over here is a hydrograph showing you some coastal groundwater levels and what they look like over time. There's also some other information on here that's pretty useful. The blue bars are groundwater production for the basin, and that like what the demand is. And then you'll see some faint brown shading, and those are periods of drought. And then there's two hydrographs on there. The black line is a coastal well here of Capitola, up near the coast, and the purple line is one at Seacliff Beach. And you see they're not exactly the same. They're slightly different, and the fluctuations are really mostly to do with when those aquifers were pumped. The black line is the Perisma A, and the purple line is Perisma BC. So different aquifers. At the top there, I have some text to say up to 1988, demand in the basin for groundwater was increasing. They pumped more and more and more up to that point, up to 88. And then from 88 onwards to about 2004 over here, it was fairly constant. Demand was fairly constant, but at the highest level that it had been in the basin thus far. And in that time, there's declines in groundwater levels, you know, maybe 10 feet in that A unit, 30 feet or so in the BC unit. So they responded differently. They were also pumped differently. And so in the last 5 years or so, we've had this recovery. We've talked about that before. Even though there has been a drought, there has been recovery. And that's mostly to do with the conservation that has happened since 2005 onwards. See over here, there's been a nice consistent decline in groundwater demand because of public awareness, conservation, those things, which we've talked about before. So these are coastal wells. Now inland, we don't have municipal wells pumping large volumes of water. There are private wells out there. So the little gray dots that you see there are all the wells that the county has records, permit records for. And they're a lot in inland areas because they have to provide water for themselves, right? So these are hydrographs that come from those wells. The county has a groundwater monitoring program for private wells. Select number of wells are measured twice a year to see what their groundwater levels are like. Otherwise, we would have no data out there. Very few private well owners are going to take meticulous records. So this is what we have to see what's happening with groundwater out up there. And these three hydrographs at the bottom here, they're for this area between Actus and Valencia Creek. And since 2008, when this monitoring program started, they haven't varied very much, within 10 feet. And even the last drought, maybe 5 feet. So that's telling us that those private wells are pumping, are not causing any overdraft to the basin. They're just pumping pretty much what's recharged to them. Up in the northern portion, there's another well that's in a different area. It's in where the a aquifer, which it's screened in, it outcrops. So when it rains, it recharges that pretty quickly, and you see a response. You can see that high, almost 20 feet increase in 2016 when we had really good rain after the drought. And the pink area there is an interesting area I wanted to point out because the granite is really shallow there. So those wells west of Brancaporte Creek are actually pumping in the granite, which officially is not in the basin. So although the county, those blue dots there are those county monitoring wells that they use in that program that they have, they're monitored, but theoretically they're not in the basin, so they're not wells that we would be looking at for this GSP. So for this sustainability indicator, we have to, and from just about all of them, we have to select representative monitoring wells. And you've heard us talk about this a little bit, and we haven't given you examples of where these might be, but in this case I'm giving you some examples of where these might be. I looked at all the monitoring wells that we have available. There's those county wells, the blue dots there. There are some over here, some in this area, and over here some pink dots. Hopefully you can see these on your if you've got hard copies, it's really hard to see these. That's interesting because those pink ones there are private wells that are monitored by Soquel Creek Water District. I'm not sure if the city does as well. But that's when any new municipal well goes in, they will monitor nearby private wells for 10 years after that well goes online to see if there's any effects from the wells. One of the only water agencies I've ever known that does such a thing. So we have some data there as well. And then there are the coastal monitoring wells here along the coast. You're familiar with those orange dots. And then the triangles there are production wells. Something that you may not have seen like this before is I have this yellow area, and that is what I call the area of municipal production. So if you've been wondering where is all the municipal production happen, it's within that yellow area there. I've joined up the inlandmost production wells to show you that. And then the coastal wells you can see how they've been located to protect those production wells from seawater intrusion. They're kind of the sentinel, the first line of defense there. So from all these, we have other things to consider. We really want a representative monitoring well. It's got to be representative of groundwater conditions in the area. We have to have some data for it, and we have to know its construction. We would prefer it to be just for monitoring, that it's not a production well as well, because you could go along to take your sample or to take your measurement and the well's pumping, and that's not representative of the groundwater. In hydrogeology, we prefer to have the static level. So it's good to know the pumping level. What we really need is a static level. So those yellow dots, the largely yellow dots, are potential representative monitoring wells, different parts of the basin. But we have to go and do a bit of analysis to make sure those really are representative, and in the GSP we have to give a reason why we say they are representative. So there's a bit of technical work to be done once we decide it's going to be, that's going to be the well. So here comes the question. It's not really a question yet, but significant and reasonable conditions. When we think about that in our minds, what in the past has been significant and unreasonable with respect to really low groundwater levels in the basin? Have we had really, really low groundwater levels in the basin? Well, we have, because we've got seawater intrusion. Okay, so, and these things, out of these 3 points I put up here, are all things we all discussed, I think, in meeting 1. Well, what our kind of sustainability goal was. We didn't want certain things to happen. So inducing seawater intrusion happens when water levels go down. Also, disconnecting streams from groundwater. So the streams are not fed by groundwater anymore, or that the hydraulic gradient changes, so there's much less water going in than there used to be because you've changed the gradient because of lowered groundwater levels. Those are covered with by other sustainability indicators. One we've done, seawater intrusion, and the other one we're going to be doing next month. But what we did talk about also in that first meeting is the impacts to other groundwater users, to well owners, pretty much. And they may be municipal, domestic, or private, industrial, agricultural. So when I've been looking at significant and unreasonable for this sustainability indicator, that's what I focused on. But please let me know if there are other things that we need to add to this. Remember, this is just proposal from me or from the technical team, and you guys are representing your stakeholders, and you might have some other things that I haven't thought about. So in general, the statement that I have up here with the variables listed for significant and reasonable is that you'd have groundwater lowering of a certain amount that affects certain wells, well type. They affect the well and changes its condition. Now, that's kind of vague, but if I go through those variables, it'll become clear to you. So also that I have a percentage up there. So for example, you could say lowering of groundwater levels that causes 5% or more of agricultural wells to go dry. Would that be significant and reasonable? So that's kind of what I'm getting at. But so the percentage, I'm not sure to actually have a percentage is a good thing. I've thought about it since we developed this. Maybe it's better to have something descriptive, because how are we going to know where all the wells are? We don't know now. We surely won't know in 20 years. More wells will come in. It'll be very hard to do that. But I think maybe if we had something descriptive, like majority or something like that. But we'll have that discussion just now. So, you know, and the use type, I think when we last started trying to talk about this, the feeling I got from everyone is that all wells should be, you know, no one well gets priority, well type gets priority over another. They're all equally important. And then the well condition is the important one here. I think Derek was talking about that the well goes dry. That would be significant and unreasonable. That would be devastating if a lot of wells went dry, right? You could also say the groundwater level goes below the top of the screen, or that it is a certain distance from the bottom of the well. So, and there are implications for those, which I'm going to show you in a slide coming up here. That is, if you're going to drill your well, when it's drilled, usually the driller will look where the water level is, and then we'll look where the most permeable sediments are, and then we'll put the screens in, you know, where they think you're going to get the most water. So when the well's drilled, your groundwater level's up there. Over time, terrible things happen. The groundwater level falls down. Now you have only these screens are producing water. Before, all three of them were producing water. You got a lot of water. Now the groundwater level dropped. Now your yield is less. If the groundwater level goes below the bottom of the well, well, that's catastrophe. Then you're dry. And so when I talk about, you know, you have the water level a certain height above the bottom of the well, you're still getting some yield, but it might not be your full yield. We cannot account for every single well in the basin. So we're trying to come up with something that kind of is a catch-all. This is a difficult one to do with the type of data that we have available. When I showed you those wells out there with the little gray dots, that's probably only 1/3 of the wells out there. Not all of them have permits, or they don't have records of them. So another thing to point out is most wells have groundwater levels going below the top of the stream. Even municipal wells have that. Those private well monitoring programs I work on, a lot of them, when they stop pumping, the groundwater level goes below the top of the well. So that's not significant and reasonable. That happens all the time. Just things to think about. So here's our proposal of lowering of groundwater levels at course 5%, and that, again, I'm not that happy with that 5%, although the 5% does account for shallow wells. If I look at the great big population of well data we have, about 5% are pretty shallow. And we'd say all groundwater pumping wells, all types of wells, and fall below 20 feet from the bottom of the wells. And I think I've pretty much gone through the rationale already about why we have proposed it. What's up there? Questions?
Yes. Are we making any assumptions about the characteristics of these wells when we lump them all together? I mean, some of them could be rather old wells that weren't made as deep at the time as we would make them if we were putting them in now.
Right.
And so how does that affect our calculation and our discussion of them? I mean, if wells are going dry, but we think that they were old wells that were too shallow anyway,
right.
Do we count them when we're calculating the 5%?
Well, again, I'm not sure about the 5%.
But whatever measure we use.
Yeah, whatever. Yes, and there are a lot of wells that will say 100 feet deep. And usually if a well's 100 feet deep and it's right next to the creek, it's in the alluvial aquifer. It's not in the parisma. All these other ones we're talking about, it's a different aquifer. So it gets dealt with a little differently. Sometimes I know that someone wants a well drilled, but they only have $20,000. So they say, drill the well so I can get, I can pay you. So yes, that does happen. And so hopefully, when we look at the distribution of depth of wells, there will be anomalies at the sides on the ends that we can take out. Yeah.
Right. So just the next slide. So this is where we want to actually pause and have a discussion, including questions like the one David just asked. But you have a slide after this that recaps the initial staff proposal. If you want to just go over what it is.
Yeah. Okay. So
John was going to answer David's question. Can we just hear it before we
continue?
Just because it's like on topic right now.
Well, I was just going to say a lot of the older shallow wells got shaken out during previous droughts. And during previous droughts in the 70s and in the 90s, we had a lot of wells going dry and people drilling new wells. And this latest drought, we had practically no wells going dry that we ever heard about. So I think folks are in better shape than they were a number of years ago, and particularly that granitic area that Georgina mentioned too, on the west side of the basin. We had a lot of wells going dry out there.
Sorry, a lot did go dry?
Pardon?
You said a lot?
During previous droughts. We haven't heard of any of them going dry during the last drought.
You're talking like back in the 70s?
Yeah, 70s and 90s.
So it might be just useful to say why, and the off chance that you all don't know, but granite is not a very good water, it doesn't hold water very much. That's why there are more problems in fractured granite aquifers. There's not very much there to the first place, so if you get a well in there and it's not the right left, it can take pretty much whatever's out and not very much comes back very fast.
And we saw that a lot in Bonnie Doon, which is also granitic, where when the houses were first developed, they just drilled down to the top of the granite and there was water sitting there and there was plenty of water, but then when the drought hit, the water level dropped down into the granite, so then people had to drill new wells to hit better fracture zones, and those typically go down 200 to 300, 400 feet.
And they were dealing with seepage,
yeah.
Yeah.
John, there were a couple of wells up on Larson Road this last year that did go dry, but they were really shallow. They were like 125 feet deep, and they were pretty far up. They're at the top of the road. One of them, he ran out entirely. The other one, they pretty much couldn't use it anymore for irrigation at all. Okay. But that was that same idea that it was a very shallow well.
Yeah. It's still less than 5% though.
No, but the problem with 5%, which Georgina's already copped to, but if we don't know what the total amount of wells is, then how in the world can we say what 5% of the wells are? We just can't. Yeah. You cannot say that. Yeah. I thought we were supposed to use specific dedicated wells for any sort of measurement of this kind, rather than just
No,
everything.
yeah, no, and that's right. When we get to the undesirable result where we have the minimum threshold, then we can have values.
Yeah. Okay.
And that's why on this, you know, it's just that you can't say we can't say we're gonna cover every well.
Right.
We can't say that.
Yeah.
So maybe together we can come up with some better terminology to cover, you know, a good portion of them.
Okay. Okay.
Okay, good job.
Yeah, I think that that was the right question to ask, and the way I think of it is, if there are these shallow wells, at what threshold does the water levels lowering cause them to be a threshold that you could have a mitigation program for it or something where you could help people with that? But where is that threshold? And that maybe is a dollar answer.
But it seems to me that's much more likely to be in some kind of well interference between like a municipal well and private wells, like she was mentioning about where the pink dots are, than it is an individual private wells where there's really only the influence of whatever the construction of that well might have been there and the local usage.
Thanks for that suggestion, John. I had Keith and then Bruce.
So I read over this and have a lot of questions, if I can kind of string them all together. So
Is it just on significant and unreasonable?
yes, it's just on your specification. First off, I was curious as where 20 feet came from. Is it, I mean, that's a fixed number, whereas wells are different depths. I imagine the different aquifers are different widths. I imagine the amount of water in a well sitting there is different for each well. I was wondering if something other like a percentage or some other thing made more sense than 20 feet. If you could just explain how 20 feet is a good number, I would appreciate that. And then the other question I had has to do with the shallow wells. Are county regulations such that you can still drill a shallow well? So in other words, are we likely to see fewer and fewer shallow wells, like you're saying, they've gone dry? But if people can't drill shallow wells, will we see fewer and fewer of those as time goes on anyway? So those are the two main questions.
You want me to answer the last question?
Yeah.
The county regulations require a 50-foot sanitary seal at a minimum now. So they've got to be at least 50 feet, and then they go down below that. If it's being drilled for new development, they have to meet certain production requirements in terms of being able to produce 2 gallons a minute for 24 hours. So they have to be deep enough to be able to meet that production.
That's a single-family dwelling.
That's a single-family dwelling. That being said, we do have folks that have drilled wells up in the Summit area that met the county standards for new development, and then their wells subsequently go dry during the summer. That's outside of our basin, so we don't have to worry about those folks up there too much, but it does happen. If it's in an unproductive part of an aquifer, it's not a guarantee that you're going to have water just because you meet the standards initially. We have a few instances where somebody may hit an aquifer that, you know, there isn't much water deeper, and then they may ask us to be able to do a shallower seal to get that water, but that's unusual. Most of the time they're pretty deep.
Quickly, does dry mean no yield, or is it a certain level and less? Like if you've got a half a gallon a minute, is that considered a dry well?
No, if you still can produce water out of it, it's not a dry well.
Yeah.
The yield is reduced.
Yeah,
Okay.
the yield is
And so to try and answer your question on 20 feet, is that really, if you have your pump, just imagine the pump is sitting in here. Usually it would sit between these screens, say it would sit over here. You can actually only pump that well as far as the pump holes, right? And then it's dry for that well, unless you lower the pump. So if you lower the pump 20 feet, to the bottom 20 feet, you still can produce. That's where the 20 feet comes from. That's kind of what we use as a safety thing. We like to have groundwater levels about 20 feet above the pump. So if you put the pump at the bottom of the well, that's when you're desperate. That's what you would do. But I have to tell you that these levels that we're looking at, that we are going to be setting in our representative monitoring wells, it is unlikely groundwater levels will ever approach such low levels. Okay, if they haven't already, unless someone puts, it's a really shallow well, yes, it might approach the bottom. But in general, from what we have, the levels that we're going to set for minimum threshold are really very low. And but that would be considered significant and unreasonable. If we set the levels right up here, to have the wood level just fall 10 feet, that's not significant and unreasonable. We've had it fall more than that in the past, and people didn't lose their water supply. So we have to be careful when we think about what is significant and unreasonable to well owners. And the same applies for municipal wells, right? So, but what we're finding, and there's a lot of, I was going to have technical details in that little report thing that you guys had in your packet of how we were going to come up with the minimum thresholds, but I don't think, you don't need to go into that really deep technical stuff. If you want to, you can come and you can talk to me about it. But in general, we would look at those representative monitoring wells and look at all the private wells around it. See, is it representative? Have a look at their depths and do analysis based off that. But we had to use that approach rather than saying, well, we're going to analyze the entire basin. That would just take months and months and months that we don't have. So we're having to choose the areas and then look at the wells around and have a look to see how far can that water level go when it would impact the majority of the wells, or whatever percentage of those wells in our little study area around each well. Representative.
So Keith, did that help the 20 feet?
Yes.
Safety factor in terms of proximity to the pump. Yeah, Bruce, please.
So I think you answered in part what I was going to point out, which, I was going to second what John said about the 5% number. How can we do a number of 5% when we don't know how many wells we have? But so the plan is not to have 5% of all wells. It's 5% of the representative, or some percent of the representative wells. So we will have a set number of wells. And then the second part is on the 20 foot, I understand that you need some water above your pump, but the 20 foot seems arbitrary. But it is, and what if you start off at 21 feet, and you drop 1 foot, then you no longer meet the criteria. So the question is, when we choose our representative monitoring wells, or when you choose them, is part of your criteria going to be what the depth of those wells are, and you won't choose shallow wells or ones that are right on?
They have to be similar to the representative monitoring well in elevations, yeah.
Right, but also in terms of how deep down.
Where it's screened as well. Right now we have available for most of those wells, we have depth information. We don't, for screen information, we have to go into each individual log. That's not in the database. So that's, again, we will do that, but only for the ones around the well.
Gotcha. And then just, so to make sure that we're really meeting our goal of sustainability, is there going to be filter is not good use. Is there going to be a part of the process of choosing the representative groundwater wells? Is that going to be also taking into account what sustainability is, or what we think sustainable water levels are? So another way of saying that is, if it's the 30 feet above the the bottom of the well is 30 feet below the water level, and it goes, are you going to be making some judgment about going down to 20 feet is still sustainable in terms of the area and the basin, or is it going to be more just that criteria? I don't know if you understand what I'm saying. When you choose your representative water wells.
Yeah, so we set an elevation. The minimum threshold will be an elevation in that well. And we have the water level. So if I go back to, say these here, we would set the minimum threshold at, say, 160 feet or something like that. And we'd have a look at all the wells around to see, now around that well, if the water level went down that far, how would that affect these wells?
Okay.
Yeah. So, the significant unreasonable, it may have too much detail in it. And again, I'm asking for your help in maybe it's a more simple statement than having all these numerics in it, which I don't think significant unreasonable should have. It's more of a descriptive thing. But I was trying to, put some limits to it. But that does also come up when we talk about undesirable results. That's when we have much more numerics and variables that we can change. So again, and this has anyone got any issue with this kind of approach that we're just focusing on groundwater levels in wells? Is there anything else that you could think of that that chronic lowering of groundwater levels would affect any beneficial users of groundwater in the basin?
So it's a good question Marco has.
Well, it's a sort of maybe an aha moment that I had, because I read this before and I was very confused. Is that the difference is the significant and unreasonable is a statement, and to that end, I agree with you that it's a statement of quality. It doesn't need to have numbers. It's a feeling or whatever, right? Whereas it's more qualitative. Whereas unreasonable result, that is quantitative. That has to be an unreasonable result, which is the next section, has to be measured. You actually have undesirable result has to be measured, and actually, so that's where we say which wells and what the levels are. Whereas this one is just a qualitative statement, and I think, at least what I was struggling with, is that we have a ton of quantitative data in a qualitative statement, which then I don't know how to say, is it 20 feet, is it 30 feet, when it's really just a quality statement. So to your answer, to your questions you just asked, I think they should be less numeric, and a majority of wells to stop produce, and to no longer be able to produce, or whatever, more softer words.
Right, yeah.
So I wrote this without any numbers. Would you like to hear?
Yes.
So it would be lowering of groundwater levels to the degree that there's any significant change in, or there's any significant negative change, I guess, in any number of wells, a significant number of wells, something like that. I'm sorry, I'm sort of reading things that I was putting stuff in it, but it sort of goes to what you're saying, but talks more about generally lowering and negative consequence to any significant number of wells. Which you wouldn't necessarily have to have numbers to that, but that would be an undesirable result.
Immediately ambiguous, significant number, maybe that's what we need to accomplish our goals.
But then you go to the next piece of it and then define sort of in more detail what that looks like, right?
Quantitative statements are ambiguous. Qualitative statements.
Yeah, that's what I'm understanding we're trying to get to. Can I just ask just a real simple question, because it's not crystal clear. When we're talking about measuring the water levels here at the well, are we saying we're going to focus on your 12 monitoring wells that you've highlighted here, yellow? Or are you talking all the wells in the neighborhood of these 12?
No. So when we set minimum thresholds or the criteria, it'll be for those representative wells. But when we do the analysis to determine what level to set that threshold at, we will look at at wells around it to make sure that it is representative of those private wells, that it's not some anomaly.
Even though we don't know how many private wells there are on the neighborhood.
We have some information that we'll use whatever information we have.
Whatever you know.
Right, yeah. So if you look over here, we have all these little gray dots. We'll be using those little gray dots.
All right, so I have Bruce and Allison and John.
David?
Hand up to Allison.
Whatever orders, just pick one.
Okay, so we'll go David, John, Bruce.
So is it my
turn?
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm thinking in terms of what Rosemary said, and what John sort of tacked onto that, it can't be too vague, or else we won't know when we have an undesirable result. There has to be some specific definition for how, if you're looking at if you go back to where you had your definition slide, right there, we have to know what it means to be a groundwater pumping, to be the groundwater pumping wells. We have to know the field of them that we are analyzing to cover. We can't just say it causes a significant change, because we have to know what a significant change is.
So this is supposed to be descriptive. The next topic we're going to talk about is the specific stuff that you're talking about. This is supposed to be a general statement, and I'm going to ask Amanda from DWR to see if she'll support me on that. Is that understanding?
Yeah, if you looked at the Sustainable Management Criteria BMT, which is draft, it'll kind of lays it out as far as like how she's describing it. So your minimum threshold is specific to a specific location and the indicator that you're trying to identify. Mm-hmm. So whatever indicator that is, whatever you decided to measure that's the threshold that you set is what's gonna determine if you have an undesirable result. So by setting your general term as far as for the whole basin, you're looking at it at a basin scale. The minimum threshold is more of a regional scale. So it sounds like that's what she's trying to accomplish with her suggestion, is providing a more general statement as far as what you're going to consider undesirable, and then she's suggesting you setting your minimum threshold at a regional scale to know if you're actually impacting anyone at that point.
Yeah, so the significant and reasonable is a statement that you make for the entire basin. We can't be specific here, too specific, you know.
But in terms of the actual undesirable results, that could be different for different areas within the basin.
Exactly, and we're going to get to that next, yeah.
Okay, so just quick process check-ins. We have John and Bruce here, and then we're schedule-wise ready to move on to the next piece. And so I don't know if we're going to solve this right now, but this is your chance. If you haven't weighed in yet, we'd really like to hear your ideas on, I think we're hearing about the inappropriateness of percentages, and this may be too specific, but you can't go too general at the same time. But we'll do John and then Bruce, and then we're going to check in with everybody we'll do our roundtable. Go, John.
Yeah, so when we did this down in the Carmel Valley area, we were looking at, we also were considering with the significant and unreasonable as far as how it works with land use and where you look at where because a 20-foot available drawdown is going to limit the yield of your well, and how does that affect your land use? Well, it's different if you're a private person and now you can't have your garden, but if you're a small water system and you have public health concerns, so we had to wrestle with that.
So kind of weight them based off the land use?
Yeah, and how that much available drawdown would affect based on aquifer parameters, the yields, and can you support the land use currently?
Okay, that's a good suggestion.
Bruce.
Yeah, it seems to me that being too specific at this point is not required and actually not defensible, and that we should look for qualitative language that convey what you said quantitatively, and so basically you don't want to go dry, you don't want to affect the production and public health concerns, that type of statement here for what's significant and what is unreasonable, I think would be more appropriate.
Okay, good. So can you go to the other slide where I have the red? So this is what we're commenting on right here. So this is the chance to make sure we're hearing from everybody. Just go around the table, and if you have an additional comment about how you modify this or want to piggyback on a previous comment made, this way we'll capture these as we did before, and essentially then staff will go noodle on that and try to come back to you with with the proposal.
Well, I think that the threshold of public health, or what it means to use the water, would help set some of these levels that we're going for. That we can move around and look at what that looks like in the area. So that's a good suggestion.
I think so.
Yeah, I sort of echo what Mr. Jaffe just said, which I think this being a qualitative statement of the whole basin would help to not have as many numbers, because it looks too quantitative. But I think the spirit of the numbers you have kind of addresses, at least in my mind, roughly, we want most not to go dry. I mean, to sum it up in a few words.
Okay. Yes, Tom.
Yeah, I'm passing, so I don't have anything to add at the moment.
Okay, thanks. John?
Pretty much the same thing Marco said. I think we just, as long as we can say we mean to make sure that some even small percentage of the wells don't go dry, and we define what go dry means, and that's within a context of the usage. I think that's fine. I don't think we want to be that specific, but we have to be descriptive.
Thank you. Doug?
I don't like this language. I would find it much better, in this case at least, to come back to this after we've looked at measuring, the whole measuring and setting up standards. I think once you've grappled with that, it's going to be a lot easier to talk about what our overall vision is. I just think this is, it's just going to be, cream of wheat at this point.
Okay, so to iterate, to loop back after you continue discussion.
Yeah, I just think it's too hard to say what this should be at this point.
Allison?
I like the idea of the direction this is going. I don't mind the idea of going more qualitative. I worry about using language of something along the lines of most, because most would suggest like 51%, and I think that's way too many wells going dry. To what Jonathan's saying, I agree with him though that when we were looking at kind of more these numbers, they made me a little nervous, because you mentioned it actually in the presentation that when you actually drying on a well, the water level drops significantly. And so it made me nervous about some of the distance from the bottom of wells. So I want to make sure that we're protecting that. Mm-hmm. So when we're talking about maintaining a well's health and stopping it from going dry, we make sure that we talk about maintaining the production of a well, so that that's in there, because that made me nervous. That some wells, it draws down so far. So I think that's what Jonathan's getting to is as well. So I just want to make sure that's protected, that not all wells draw down the same amount when you use them, and that the language thinking that we just say most, making it a little stronger than that.
Thanks, Allison. David?
Yeah, I just think it's important that at whatever level we define the terms in ways that we can identify whether we're talking about a concept or a data-driven threshold.
John?
I would just say, through this process, I'm getting used to this language, because a couple months ago it made me nervous. Darcy was a big help in between last meeting and this meeting, and I'm understanding that at this first stage of significant unreasonable, the qualitative thing works. We don't want to get there, but we start there, then we get more specific. So I'm kind of with Rosemary, the significant number of wells seems to me kind of works. Conveniently ambiguous.
I think what Doug was saying about work with the numbers first and then come back and be able to characterize what we're saying once we have the detail of the numbers would be a fruitful process. Some of the ideas of phrases that enter my mind are things like an overwhelming majority of wells, so that it's, squishy but sort of emblematic in some sort of way. Maybe that wells drop below the productive level for the purpose for which the wells were established. I don't know if that gets us anywhere or not, but some ideas. Okay.
Yeah, thank you. That's good. Good, Keith.
I've heard a lot of really good ideas, and I would love to see them all together and summarized. That's fine.
Thank you. Yeah, that's coming up. Cruz.
Nothing new.
Been extremely informative. It's all a little overwhelming, and I'm still kind of coming up to speed with it all. One thing that I keep thinking in the back of my head, after working with agricultural producers for many years during my career, but also representing small water systems, and in a neighborhood that shares one well. And maybe we talked about this as a group, but I wasn't here, but the level may not change significantly from use, but there could be also changes in recovery time that might be significant for irrigated agriculture and for small water system users. So I'm not quite sure if we're talking about recovery time, because the use you can draw down and the water can go back up where it was, and maybe it isn't very significant. But how long does it take to recover is maybe something that we're not focusing on, that we might want to consider as an indicator or as a variable.
Okay, thank you. And finally, Dave.
Well, I appreciate everybody's comment. I would like to see it more qualitative and get away from the numbers. It also would be helpful to define, are we talking about on a regional level, are we talking about specific wells, to have that in a qualitative language.
Okay, thank you for that. So we're going to move to the next topic, which is undesirable results. And again, we'll do some introduction here, make the staff proposal, and then we'll discuss it.
Okay. So now we're getting down to more detail on numerics. So there's a set of conditions or here variables, and those will define what undesirable is at each representative monitoring well. So at this stage, we're looking at local or regional levels throughout the basin. So, so what set of conditions would lead us to significant unreasonable conditions? So you see, this is where we have to build on. This process involves building on from significantly unreasonable to undesirable results and then to minimum thresholds. So variables that we could change here is, in general, it's going to be groundwater levels or elevations that over a certain time period, if it falls below the minimum threshold, that's undesirable. But there are statistics, because you have a lot of groundwater level data. And is it any data? Is it an average? Is it any number of statistical terms there that we could use? So what, in general, we're looking at how often does the water level go below the threshold. That's just simply what that says here. So in the statistic, you could take the minimum value throughout, say, a year. And if at any point that value fell below the minimum threshold that you've set in that representative monitoring, you have an undesirable result. You could also look at 75th percentile, which means that 3/4 of the data need to be above that threshold. And if you have a quarter or more than a quarter below the threshold with a water level lower, then that's undesirable. You can use an average as well. A lot of people will probably use the average. And then over a period of time, so you have to evaluate this groundwater level data over what period of time. And so here I've given examples of monthly, quarterly, or annually. And if you are looking at monthly data, you probably need a data logger. Most of the monitoring wells that we selected as potential representative wells, they have data loggers in them, getting data every 15 minutes. And we would just have to add some to the others that don't have those data loggers. Quarterly, you could collect at least monthly to get enough data to do your statistics, and then annually you could just measure quarterly. But you're losing information the wider your data are collected, the time between data collection. The minimum threshold, we've been talking about it, trying not to go into too much detail about how we would do it, but it's a numeric value, it's an elevation in that well that we will establish. And the aim is to set that level so that it reflects what's considered a chronically lowered groundwater level. We don't want to set a level that's way too high, and that's not chronically, it's happened before in the past that the water level's been there. No one, so we have to be, like I mentioned earlier, a bit reasonable about that. The lower the groundwater elevation level that you set, the easier it would be to stay above it, obviously, but then there's a chance you'll impact that. So there's a fine line here of how we set this level. So we're not going to ask you about minimum threshold, but that's kind of the metric that we're using, right? So our proposal here is to use the average groundwater elevations every month. And if the average falls below the minimum threshold, then that would be undesirable. And you could change that, you could add a little bit more flexibility. You could say the average over 1 year. Or with less flexibility, you can use the 75th percentile, the 3/4 have to be above, over a 1 month period. These are examples. And these, I'd be happy with any of these, but we kind of like the one with the 1 month. It's going to give detail that if you used a longer period, you would lose some of that detail.
Okay, so this is the technical staff proposal we want to have a discussion about right now. Actually, you can just go back and read that up. So I have Marco, John, and Becky.
So question, so this is the average we come up with, this statement applies to each monitoring well, right?
No,
so
the representative.
Sorry, correct, each of the representative monitoring wells. And so the question is, if we say the average, but there is, for each representative monitoring well, there's only one minimum threshold,
yes,
not date bound. So we would have to pick that to be the lowest of the lows, knowing that in a year, if you do monthly, we know that in a year, it does this naturally anyway, right? Yes. So we'd have to make sure that it's lower than the lowest.
And that, in setting that level, we're not impacting other wells.
And yes.
You see, that's going to be our gauge of where to set that.
Okay. Thank you.
John.
My question is, I think I understood from what you said earlier about the map that you're suggesting just those large yellow circles. Are we not planning to use the coastal monitoring wells for any of this groundwater monitoring?
Good question. Good question. So for each sustainability indicator, they're going to get their own set of representative monitoring wells.
Mm-hmm.
Generally don't want to select the same wells. Because, for example, coastal monitoring wells are being used for seawater intrusion. Their levels are going to be way higher than what we would set using this method. So they become, that's the level that we shoot for on the coast. Yeah.
But we've seen them fluctuate also quite a bit. I would imagine perhaps more than the ones up here inland like you're looking at here.
Yeah, but so we did the same process last time, and unfortunately you weren't here. So we have that gets averaged over a 10-year period, actually. Well, a 5, I think we're talking about 5, and we're going to talk about it a little bit later on.
All right.
Keith?
So I was curious about the time period chosen. And reading your background information, you were saying that using a month is less likely to be influenced by the seasonal pumping. Where, to me, it seems like if you go over a year, you get rid of the whole season altogether. So I was hoping you could explain that. I mean, I look at it as, if you go over a whole year, then sometimes it's going to go lower in the fall when it's driest, and then it'll come back up in the spring. If you could just explain the difference between monthly and annual.
I'm surprised that it was, maybe there was a mistake in that document, but it should be so if you average, say, quarterly, usually the quarters are by roughly pumping cycles, periods. You know, it will be the fall, spring, and winter kind of. And if you average that, you would lose some of the detail. And obviously the year would get even more, but with a month you would then retain the average number for that month. It wouldn't get smooshed out over 3 months.
So you're saying if you do it by the month, each month has a different minimum threshold?
No, not minimum threshold, but you evaluate that number. So every year when you do your annual report and you say, how did we do it? Because when this plan is implemented, you grade every year, you have a look to see, did we ever fall below the minimum threshold? So every month we'll, you see the hydrograph, right? But we're going to average data per month and see, did it go below the water level? Because yes, you will have fluctuations. There's pumping and all sorts of things happening, but you need to you need to generalize that in some way, and that statistic generalizes it over 1 month to give you detail. If you generalize it over a longer period, you would lose that detail.
12 samples per year. 12 samples per year to get an average.
Yes.
I like this.
Well, no, you get to
Well,
take
averages.
closer.
Just
You
what I
get to,
thought.
I gotta go back, sorry, Eric. This is gonna be. So here's,
12 monthly
here's,
averages. 12 monthly averages?
12
Yeah.
monthly averages.
12 monthly averages. I like that even more.
Monthly averages.
Okay. Language here.
so you have all of this, so every month you would calculate, it will change from a line to a dot on the map representing the average water level that month. And then you would have a look at that over the year. There would be a line drawn, say, over here. That's your minimum threshold. If that ever went down in one of those months, if the average monthly went down below that threshold, then you exceeded that threshold.
It just occurs to me that it'll never go down in March, because there will always be a lot of water in March. And if it's going to go down, it's going to be October every year.
Well, that's why she said when we pick our minimum threshold, which we'll decide later, we have to pick it so that it's probably the lowest low.
It'll be the lowest
month. It'll be
Yeah.
a July, August will probably be the number we'll pick. And you're right, we probably won't hit it in January. But the point is, do we want it to be 12 dots? Do we want it to be 4 dots? Or do we want it to be 1 dot?
Yeah.
And so the question is, like, the debate you're deciding is, do you want 12 data points to look at your thing with, or do you want 1? And you get more detail with 12 dots. Or like you can go a longer period of time and not know what's going on with your aquifer if you want to look at it annually, or you can look at it once a month. And so it's a question of how often do we want to look at the data and compare it to that. There's still going to always be one line at the bottom. The question is, do you want once a year to have a point of reference, or do you want 12 points of reference to compare to? And that's the decision we have to make.
Okay, Bruce?
So, just since that graph's up there, you could average for that whole time period, and it'd be a line about halfway in between.
Right.
But you could have an undesirable result at a lower level than that whole line, that whole average. So I'm all for going to the monthly, because the undesirable result occurs at that time scale. If you've got a month where you're running, you go dry, it doesn't help that 11 months out of the year you're not dry. That's the undesirable result. But just to know the effect of how we set this minimum threshold, as I recall, if we go below the minimum threshold, that's allowable as long as we're making progress towards not going below it.
Right. You can go below that minimum threshold prior to 2040. After 2040, after 20 years of the plan being implemented, that's when they start judging to see, or grading you to see, are you always above that minimum threshold? Yes, and you can allow to go down every now and again, which I am almost sure we won't even approach these minimum thresholds. But you have the possibility, and with seawater intrusion, that's more of a possibility, because we're not at protective levels in some wells. But you could go down, but by 2040, we have to show that we're sustainable. And they would say you're having an undesirable result if you exceed any minimum thresholds, or undesirable results you need.
So is the way that you're going to recommend the minimum thresholds, you made a statement that you're going to recommend them based on historical, but wouldn't it be wiser to set these minimum thresholds based on some criteria for what sustainability is? It could be during a historical period, I don't know if it's the case, it really wasn't sustainable. And that sustainability is not just a local sustainability, it's the sustainability of the basin.
Okay, so it's my understanding that this indicator is talking about chronic lowering of groundwater levels. So it's just in setting groundwater, sustainability is all the indicators together. And this one is just looking at chronic lowering of groundwater levels. And yes, in the coastal areas where water levels went down, say 140 feet, that was not sustainable. So it's going to not be at that, it's probably going to be some level up higher. Yes. It's not always going to be at the historical low. It could be lower than that in some cases, or in others where that was excessive, that it would be up higher.
So I'm not as concerned about this minimum threshold, knowing that it could go below the minimum threshold as long as we have a plan that's going to, by 2040, prevent that from happening.
But Georgina, we're not setting our minimum threshold today, we're just deciding how often. I mean, that's not even where.
So can I just ask a question for clarification? So it's my understanding that eventually when we get this whole set of parameters for all these sustainability indicators put together, that groundwater modeling runs will be done to allow us to say, under historical hydrology and climate change hydrology, right? So that we can, one of the things we can do is we can say, well, if we have a really different climate in the future with respect to recharge, how would that affect this indicator? And we could set it at a level that would be protective relative to what we thought might be happening. And that's where the iterative process comes through. So right now we're sort of putting something out there that the staff can use to run these models and bring back some information about, if you use historic hydrology, this is what you get. And if you use climate change hydrology, well, you might want to set it at a slightly different place.
We just need a starting point to start evaluating those models.
Okay, so I have Doug and then David.
I'm passing.
David.
I mean, it sounds like you start mitigating towards more flexibility and avoiding the undesirable results, but that wouldn't necessarily be great for you if you're one of the people whose well is running dry.
Right, right. So that's why we've selected monthly, not annually. Daily, someone in my office suggested daily, and I said, no, that's not possible. So I went for monthly. Okay, so that's yeah, because to a private well owner, going dry for one day in the hottest day of summer is a big deal. But again, I think the water levels would be high enough that we'd have to have a drought much worse than any drought we've had to approach those levels.
Yeah, I mean, it's basically getting some security in what's been going on in the last 5 years.
Allison?
I like it as written. I think most people do, to be honest. I'd be curious to hear the rest of you say, but I like it as written.
Okay, any other comments before we go around the room? We're about ready for that. Okay.
Just quick clarification, is it right that by having the monthly monitoring, it would also allow from year to year management adjustments in a meaningful kind of time frame targeted based on the variation that's reflected in the data?
Correct, yes.
Okay, so let's go around the room and maybe we'll start, Dana, with you this time and we'll go the other way around.
I think I'm fine with the staff proposal.
I'm fine also with the way it's written.
I agree with monthly.
Fine.
Yeah, I'm fine. I don't quite know what average means, but I like the monthly period.
Love the staff proposal.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's fine with me.
Fine. I'm fine.
For the record, yes.
I like it, and I think that, I don't know how detailed this needs to be, but it's the most easily implementable to get that data, but if the data logger were to fail, you put something in, like you'd use that hand measurement, so you'd be visiting the wells.
Yeah. There are, someone counting 12 or so wells, so that's manageable, yeah. To go take those hand measurements.
Well done, technical staff.
Ooh, okay, the easiest one we'll probably we'll have. We'll see if any subsidence ones can beat that one.
Okay. All right, so we're at 7 o'clock. We're about 10 minutes ahead of schedule, which is wonderful. And so we want to pause now for public comment. And again, this is a great opportunity for members of the public who've been tracking to weigh in on the discussion we just had here and to also share your ideas around the staff proposal. So if I could see a show of hands of members of the public who would like to speak this point?
Just maybe a quick comment.
Is there anybody else? Okay, why don't you come on up, and if you could stand up here and give your name and affiliation, and make sure we hear you clearly. And you have 3 minutes for your comment.
Okay. Larry Freeman, private consultant, water user, Soquel Creek Water District subcommittee member. So going back to the original one, we're looking at the qualitative criteria. Would it make more sense just to tie it into the fact that you need to sustain a healthy water supply to all your customers and the private well owners? You know, that's kind of the main goal right there, right? If you can't, then you've got a really undesirable condition. Okay, so you talk about one person for one day and get, you know, in a private well. Well, I know the water districts have to they already have that built into their criteria, you know, as their goal, you know, to provide that safe, healthy environment. So if you do that, and you're not allowing the sea level intrusion, which is a whole another, I guess, another criteria we're talking about. If that was your primary goal, I think if you think of it in that way, you know, whether it's an ag use or private well owner or municipal or commercial user, if the people that are delivering the water can't get it to them, then that's an undesirable condition. And then you start getting down into your specifics of the individual monitoring wells and things like that. So the other thing is, if the monitoring wells can be installed with telemetry. So if a transducer fails, you'll know it's down immediately if you're running it all through a database real time. And I know, so I'm not sure what the county or the city has, but Soquel Creek Water District has a really good set of time series software and database management software. And then the other thing was just an editorial detail when you're talking about 20 feet from the bottom of the well, about say 20 feet above the bottom of the well.
From the bottom?
Instead of from.
Exactly.
Right.
All right, Larry, thank you very much.
Yeah, sure.
Any final comments from members of the public? Okay, great. So I have 7:03 on the clock behind me. It says 7 o'clock. So why don't we come back and do this clock at exactly 7:50? So we'll take a 15-minute break. So thank you, everybody. And if there's extra food in the back, oh yeah, so Darcy's passing out the ballot. Please use this time. Okay, so we're returning to a sustainability indicator that we didn't make to last month because we ran out of time talking about seawater intrusion. So this is land subsidence, and again we have Georgina will present some background information, and then we'll present a technical staff proposal.
Can we just all agree we don't want it and we're done? It's like, do we need to really spend a lot of time talking about it? Subsidence is a bad thing. It's a bad thing for pretty much anybody doing anything. You don't want it at a farm, you don't want it under a building, you really don't want it if you built your house. I mean, like, when is it a good thing? And if it's not a good thing, I mean, and we're gonna get it from earthquakes anyway, why don't we just say we don't want it and we're done?
That's what everyone says.
I know, but why do we have to discuss
It has to be documented. DWR here wants to hear that it was discussed amongst stakeholders. We agree with you.
That's my motion.
All right, thank you, Doug. Thank you. Yeah, so this one may actually be more straightforward than some people think. So she's going to present 3 staff recommendations, 1 for significant and unreasonable conditions, and 2 for undesirable results for 2 different
Well, actually, Doug just gave my presentation. No, okay, now I'm going to go into it's like you said, right. So subsidence, I think we all have an inkling of what that is. It's either really sudden or a gradual lowering of the land surface. And how it happens generally is aquifer system compaction and drainage and alteration of some organic soils, and then things that really would not affect this basin, like mining and oil and gas extraction, hydrocompaction. Maybe sinkholes could happen if you had a burst pipe, thawing permafrost. These things don't happen here, and they would not cause land subsidence for us. But what might cause land subsidence in probably the Burisma aquifer is aquifer system compaction. And what happens in aquifer is made up, here's an aquifer here, of sand and gravel where the water generally is where it's stored and where you extract it from. And then you've heard us talk about aquatards, which are fine-grained layers of silts and clays. And the compaction actually happens in those parts, not in the aquifer. It happens in the aquatard where you have a change, if you have a really big change in groundwater levels over a short period of time, you change the pre-consolidation stresses. And you have clay particles that are kind of, this is how they're arranged, the little platelets are arranged naturally when they're laid down or deposited. And then when you have this change in stress, they all get compressed like this and change orientation, and then they lose their porosity and storage capacity. And the land surface is going to drop down as a result. So this is the one that is really related to groundwater level changes. And so at the top there, now your land surface has dropped down. There's two different types of land subsidence. You can get a recoverable inelastic subsidence, where natural seasonal fluctuations in groundwater levels, and you could have really small, like less than a millimeter changes in land surface, and that's elastic, goes up and down. But then the bad part is you can get the permanent or inelastic subsidence that you can't recover that. So those are the two different types, and I'll give you an example of some of those as well. But that's really the mechanism to land subsidence and how it's related to groundwater levels. So where is land subsidence around us? Well, we have it just north in San Jose. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. The big blob over there, the pink one, is the Central Valley, probably the most well-known case in California. And then there are some other scattered ones around. There's nothing on this map for the Mid-County Basin. And this is a map from the USGS website, I believe, and where they're actually supporting DWR and providing information on land subsidence, because they are pretty much the experts on it. Santa Clara Valley, that up in San Jose area, they started having subsidence in 1933. So much land subsidence, they had 8 feet drop. It's significant. It did a lot of damage. And it was because they were pumping too much groundwater. So they figured out they needed to bring in some projects, and they did that successfully. This over here is their hydrograph. It goes from 100 feet of 200-foot drop, and they had that much land subsidence. But that is mostly because their geology is susceptible to land subsidence and to that compaction of the aquatards. And they brought on projects to recharge the groundwater, and their levels have gone up. And since this time, they've done a lot of studies into land subsidence. They really understand it. They've monitored it. They've looked at relationship between water levels and subsidence. And now they're comfortable with this. They experience actually 0.12 of an inch of elastic subsidence every season. And they're okay with that. They have set their threshold to be that, for that elastic subsidence. They also have wells that they've set as representative monitoring wells that have groundwater elevations, and they want to keep their levels above those thresholds, similar to what we're going to be doing on the next slides here. And this here is a map this is showing the subsidence here. Where their hotspot, where the most subsidence is, and that was done by satellite imagery. They use it to determine the very small differences in ground surface. They can monitor that using satellites, and that image just comes from there. So in the San Joaquin Valley, the very famous slide, picture over here of the research of the time standing in 1977 on the ground, but in 1925 the ground was actually up at the top of that hole. So they've had a lot of land subsidence. And things that it does, it changes the gradient on the canals and the water projects, and it can. And that's all gravity, drained down to Southern California. That will change that, damages the infrastructure. It can reverse the topography so that a river is going to reverse its direction and run dry, like in that picture. And then a more recent USGS scientists there standing in 2013 during the drought, I guess that was, and you can see how subsidence has still been continuing since 1965. So they have a real problem there, and that's all to do with groundwater levels. They have a very big thick clay, called the Corcoran clay, that has suffered this subsidence. So their geology was right for this. So how's it monitored? I mentioned the satellite images that you could use. INSAR, it's called INSAR at the bottom there. Then you can use land surveying methods typical using benchmarks. You can use some equipment that you put into a borehole dedicated for monitoring land subsidence. You can do continuous GPS tracking. There are various things. None of these are done in this basin. There's never been a need to do them, so we don't actually have that. So I've talked about a little bit already about some of the effects of subsidence. Changing gradients of water conveyance structures, causing damages to roads, railways, pipelines, bridges, even wells. And then in the natural system, I talked about, there's the decreased storage within the aquifer where everything gets compacted down. Topography changes, rivers changing course. And again, none of these have been reported or observed in this basin. What I did is took a look at where the maximum groundwater level changes have happened in the basin and when that happened. Yes?
Go back one slide, please. Under the man-made infrastructure list, a number of those things are things that have happened in our basin. What you're saying is that there are things that haven't been attributed to subsurface subsidence. We've had from surface subsidence.
Rather than earthquakes.
Earthquakes, obviously, yes.
I mean, last winter we had a lot of roads go out.
Right, now this is only to do directly attributable from subsidence.
But if we're not measuring that, how do we know?
Yeah, that's a good point. But usually it's been a sudden.
Yeah, we haven't seen any of that damage relative.
So the next slide, kind of what I did is I looked where the biggest changes happened, because it's going to be associated with when the big change happened. And that was in 1988, 89, those years, and then some more recent years. And nothing has been linked to subsidence, I could say, right? There's 140 feet in Purisma 8. So this area here is kind of where there's been a lot of drawdown in the past. Since then, groundwater levels have recovered a lot. And we're not looking at all like with levels down 140 feet anymore. Then there is, so the aromas down in this area here, different aquifer, only 5 feet of drawdown maximum. So there's no problem. The only one really is in the Purisma. There has historically been large drawdown, but nothing, no subsidence linked to that. Then the Purisma AA, the TU unit up in this area here, more recently, there's been only 35 feet of drawdown. And what that looks like, that's over here. 35 very recently, because they only just the last few years put in some wells, and it's quite a deep aquifer in an undeveloped part. So now we're getting some data, and yeah, it's going down. We don't really know we can't link that to subsidence. Compared to over here, this one here has got data back from 1985, and you can see, wow, it went down. This is the one that went 140 feet. Again, and we've had all this time period, how many is that, 30 years or more, And the levels have gone down pretty far. Again, no land subsidence associated with those time periods. So this one here, too soon to observe subsidence effects. I'm not going to go out on a limb and say, oh no, we haven't seen it, but we need more years to be able to say with any certainty. So DWR allows us to use some proxies because we don't have this subsidence monitoring data. And so we can, if we can demonstrate significant correlation between groundwater elevations and subsidence, we can use groundwater elevations as a proxy for this measurement. So I'll show you what that looks like on a hydrograph. It's easier. So we have this well here. We can set a minimum threshold at the minimum that we've observed, or a minimum groundwater level that we've observed. And that would be the minimum threshold for that well. Should we set it down lower? I don't think so, because I don't think we can say with certainty that we would not have subsidence there. So I'd be happy to set it somewhere over at the bottom of that well, or up to the lowest point in the hydrograph. So here's Doug's proposal. Significant and unreasonable would be any subsidence occurring. That, you know, that's what we say. This is based off of historical lack of subsidence, and if we suddenly had it now, that surely would be significant and unreasonable. It would mean that our groundwater levels have plummeted, and you know, it would be very unexpected. You could allow, you know, some basins are going to say yes, we will allow some subsidence to happen in undeveloped areas where we can have a little bit, you know, a 1/10 of an inch or something, you know. We don't have the data to be able to say that, so that's why we're really sticking with the any land subsidence occurring. Also, in undeveloped areas, that's really the inland areas where the private wells are. We don't have the kind of pumping that's going to cause big changes in groundwater levels. So the chances of that happening, unless there's some big project out there, I don't think that you would have conditions that would be conducive to subsidence.
Is there an implied statement, no land subsidence as a result of aquifer compaction? I mean, we know we'd have land subsidence if an earthquake happened, or we might.
Yeah, we could add that, definitely, yeah.
But
Can it go up?
We don't know.
Even so, aren't we sort of in a loop from the absence of data, that we don't have the ability to measure whether there's any land subsidence from aquifer collapse?
There's been no observed subsided, yes, because of aquifer pumping.
Right.
How would you know if you had it?
So you would, well, from the city's point of view, how would you know if you had it?
Well, I'm wondering if most wells, when they're drilled, they pull the borings, and they look at the hydrogeology, and would you be able to observe the compaction of the aquatards? No.
I mean, they do that when they put in a foundation. They take borings to see how deep they need to go and what kind of foundation they need to do.
Well, I mean, I think what you'd have to do, based on what Georgina has said, is you'd have to put in some kind of a boring and then, you know, do some measurements on it over time. But what she's saying is that you can use the water levels as a surrogate, and if you can, and given the fact that we're not seeing this, it's like, why wouldn't you?
As Marco was saying, the caveat is that you're saying that is there subsidence that is caused by changing your water level in your aquifer?
No, he's saying we should add, it says,
to make it clear that it's not being caused by surface type conditions. But if we don't have the capacity to measure that, how would we know?
Is your concern that this language is not strong enough because you worry it's already occurring, or that it's too weak? I mean, what is your concern, David?
Well, I lean in the direction of allowing some subsidence so that if you get a little bit and you don't know where it's coming from, you don't have to freak out and think that you've had an undesirable result. But that's why I'm asking the question, because staff is proposing any land subsidence occurring, and I'm still asking the question, how would you know?
So, well, go ahead.
I just think I think we're back into this confusion about what's an unreasonable condition and what we're measuring, okay? I think.
Right, yeah, let's talk about.
I think all we're talking about is what's the unreasonable condition, which is, I agree, it's from over pumping the aquifer and having the ground settle. That's what we want to avoid. Now that we can talk about measuring it, which is I think your argument, David, is really that, is it sufficient to just simply be looking at groundwater levels? Shouldn't we also be measuring? And I guess my question is, why can't we also measure, we got all these representative wells we're going to have around. Why don't we measure where they are and monitor over time what level they're at, make certain they don't drop? I mean, they're representative wells, and if we start seeing subsidence, we pick some wells and measure their elevation, and then, if you start seeing subsidence, you start worrying about it.
I think we're back to that whole idea of the technical measurement versus a qualitative statement, which is, on a qualitative idea, are we okay with subsidence at all, even if we can or have not been measuring it? Like, are we okay if it occurs? Because later, when we get into we do talk about measuring it, at least in the AA and TU, because like Regina said, we don't know if it's been occurring because those wells are new. So it's a qualitative idea of are you okay with subsidence? Whether or not you know it's been occurring or not, David, are you okay with it happening any further?
Well,
would you be okay if it said any further land subsidence? Like, on a concept, would you be okay? I know, Georgina, I'm throwing out ideas. Anyway, but on a concept, even if we know it's happening or not, that's the idea, is are we okay with it happening?
Well, and you see, I actually am uncomfortable with the notion of having a standard that is any land subsidence occurring, because things are frequently engineered to not have any subsidence, or to not have any settlement, or to not, and yet there is a range of settlement that one expects in structures or in certain things, just as foundations crack and things change a little bit, that is within the performance range that you don't get upset about it, even though it is a little bit of settlement. So that's when on the one hand you're saying we're very certain we don't have any, why would we set a standard that says we can't have any? Versus saying we would allow some because we're not worried about it.
Tom?
No, I think that covers.
So with the plan that we put forth, the GSP that we put forth, you do it based off the available data that you have. We can't just manufacture this because we've never monitored it. We can include it in the plan and say we're going to put it in, and then we are allowed to change our thresholds, actually, if we feel, if that data, and we work together with DWR, we find that data, the decisions we made today, we can do better with new data. We're allowed to do that, but we need a starting point for this round.
Maybe just one quick point. Eric, is that okay?
Yeah, please.
To my friend Dave. I think there's a distinct difference between a little settling of a house where the perimeter foundation has gone down 3 feet. You expect a little compaction of soil. That's a very small scale. Versus the subsidence, as I understand, is a massive dropping of land. What do we see in the valley? 5,200 square miles or some crazy thing?
Yeah, it's impacted by that much, yeah.
Massive versus a little foundation. So I just want to make that distinction if that helps at all.
Yeah, but I understand your point of being more pointed to what we're saying is a very blanket, it could cover all sorts of things. The lawyer in you is telling us to be focused in a bit more on the topic at hand.
Right. Well, and it's not just that, it's also, there are a number of things we haven't yet considered, like management areas, and where we see certain impacts being different when zoning in on different smaller sized areas. So we aren't necessarily always talking about just a basin-wide subsidence, but we could be talking about things in different portions of the basin depending upon how we decide to manage it.
Right.
And if you don't have a way for if you don't have data that enables you to determine causality, how do you know what you've got?
And that we can only do going forward if we have some subsidence monitoring. But the monitoring is not just a simple thing. You have to put in special wells to monitor it, and that would have to be part of the cost of implementing this plan. We would have to build that in.
And then the other question I have is the standard we select impacted by whether or not we use The proxy, the groundwater level as a proxy?
The standard.
The standard for subsidence.
Undesirable.
We say
No,
any versus
no,
allow
it's a
some.
blanket statement, doesn't matter.
Doesn't
What
matter.
measurement method we use.
So using the proxy just enables us to have a surrogate method for measuring.
That's correct.
Right.
Kind of a freebie, the way I look at it.
So this is at the conceptual level of what is considered to be significant and unreasonable.
Because the way they would be tied to one another in performance.
Right.
So other thoughts on this? So we've heard, I think several people have said that subsidence due to what? So having more specificity around that in the statement. Other
I've got a question.
Yeah, John.
Do we get any credit for saying that the geology is not susceptible to subsidence? I mean, the Parisima does not have clay layers. It has shales and mudstones. I mean, it's consolidated cemented rock. It's not layers of alluvial clay. Now, Euromus does have some alluvial clay layers, but the Parisima does not. So it's, you know, just on the face of it, it's not even susceptible to subsidence.
Yeah.
So why do we even care about it? I mean, it's just like up in the Santa Margarita, we're just saying we don't have to worry about seawater intrusion because the ocean's not there. We don't have to worry
Not at the moment, anyway.
We don't have to worry about subsidence because geologically our aquifers are not susceptible to subsidence.
I didn't add that. That is in the background document that I gave you, but yes, there is that important piece of information too. That it's probably not susceptible. The geologist in me is always a little hesitant to say something like that, but yes.
Because if we get ourselves in the position where we have to do more monitoring to prove we're not having subsidence, that could be an unnecessary expense. You know, like a special subsidence well, even though DWR is going to pay for it through the technical assistance program, those special wells are not cheap, I would guess, and as well as the satellite monitoring is probably not a cheap endeavor. So we don't want to get ourselves into a position where we have to monitor for something we know we're never going to have and spend the money doing that.
So we could set these today, but through the iterative process later decide that it's worth just arguing to DWR that we're just not susceptible, but we should still set these today.
And on that, I think,
am I understanding that right?
If you guys are okay, I'd love to go around the room. Tom, you have your card up or just? No. Or you just holding it?
He's ready to go.
He's being helpful. He's handing his card.
So actually, I'd love to go around the room again, and I don't know, maybe we'll start, Allison, with you and go this way.
Sure. I believe it was Marco's recommendation that we add the language due to groundwater pumping, so that we're knowing that our geological plates like.
Doug?
I agree with Allison.
B3.
Okay.
So I have a base dislike of absolute statements, but other than that, yeah, maybe some sort of just wouldn't want to make some statement thinking we know what we're doing, and then we end up with the state in control of our basin.
Thank you.
The benefit of an iterative process.
I'm comfortable with the addition.
Yeah, I agree with Allison to add a statement just due to circumstances.
Thank you. Rich?
I agree with Allison as well.
I
Great
can
comment,
credit
Allison.
Marco.
Wait, did we lose Cruz?
We did.
Yeah, we did.
Okay. Keith.
Okay, good for Allison.
I agree, provided it doesn't require us to, spend money to determine the negative.
Great. I'm fine with the proposed language.
And I would still add in the word between any and land, I would say any significant land subsidence occurring, and then Marco's add on.
Okay, great. All right, so let's move on to undesirable results.
So we have two different sets here because we're going to talk about using groundwater levels. So we'll have a set of undesirable results for that. It's when we use it as a proxy, and then there'll also be, this is wrong, it's when we use surface elevation for the first AA and TU aquifers. So for where we're using the proxy groundwater elevation, we would select representative monitoring wells. And we would select those in the areas where the biggest changes of groundwater are likely to occur. And we can add to these at any point in the future when things change, because we don't know what projects are going to be out there, and we don't know that. So we can change. This plan is one of the key phrases is adaptive management. So like Eric said, what we're doing now is not completely, there's no right answer, and we're going to be going down this line for several decades, and we can adjust as we go. So we'll put the monitoring wells where the biggest changes in levels are likely to be. And then we would have a certain number of wells in those aquifers that are listed, first A, B, C, D, E, and F. And we'll have, again, a statistic over a time period that the elevations cannot go below a minimum threshold that we set. And I gave you the example of the lowest, the historical low, in a certain area. Okay. And so changing the number of wells for more wells that can exceed that threshold, the more it's easier to avoid undesirable results, but then you have maybe a slightly higher risk of, in this basin, of subsidence, less wells, less flexibility, lower risk. Statistic, again, there's an average and a certain percentile. It's all the same flavor pretty much. When you're dealing with groundwater levels, it's the same thing. Time period here, I've listed quarterly and annual. The minimum threshold, is it the historic low or is it some other elevation? And then the extent, which we've covered before. So our proposal on this one is, of the representative monitoring wells we select, any of those have the average annual groundwater elevation below the historic lows in any part of the basin, because those aquifers pretty much cover the whole basin. And so the rationale is that we haven't observed it in the past. And so I'll open it up for discussion.
Right, yeah, so this is using the groundwater level proxy. Thoughts or questions about this?
So I guess I have a question about this, which is we are talking about subsidence, but we're not measuring subsidence, we're measuring groundwater level. So we could have an undesirable result in our subsidence area that has nothing to do with subsidence, but has to do with groundwater level. Like you're saying, we could actually, because we're not susceptible to subsidence, we could pass these, have an undesirable subsidence result, and yet have no subsidence.
That's true.
So that doesn't seem good to me, because that seems like we've just generated a completely false, undesirable result for ourselves.
But if we set that elevation
So low that it can never be achieved, then that's fine, but then why write the thing?
Because the statute requires it.
Because the state requires it, but that can't really be what it's
No, there's a
all
scientific thing, right? We know, she pointed out, we know at the lowest it's ever been, we haven't had groundwater supply. What we don't know scientifically is if we went 2 inches lower than that, that we wouldn't have what ground. We suspect it because it's
but
scientifically we don't know.
we could go 2 inches below it, we would then have an undesirable result. But we would not have any subsidence. Maybe we would and maybe we wouldn't. But what I'm saying is, if we didn't, we would still have an undesirable subsidence result. But we would not have any subsidence.
On the other hand, I doubt we'll go back to levels from 1980 either.
But I can also tell you that if this gives you any consolation, if the groundwater levels went that low, all of the other sustainability indicators would be failing too, so it doesn't really matter.
We are going back to 1980 levels.
In that case,
all the bells will be ringing.
Other bad things would be happening.
Okay, thank you. Coming up, John. Next.
So this is more of a question, I guess, for DWR. Are you able in the act for your plan to say, if you get below such a threshold, you would start to monitor for subsidence with other methods? So you drop below there, and you go survey all your practice wells on your wells, and you do it again and you do it again to demonstrate it. that's not causing.
So okay, the way I'm hearing the question is, so if you're what I think you're saying is you're setting your threshold. If you exceed that threshold, one of the solutions would be to monitor for subsidence, and then
So it wouldn't be a proxy for subsidence, but it would be a trigger to monitor.
Trigger to monitor.
The correction program, basically, if you miss a drinking water regulation in some cases, or an OEL kind of thing.
And so you're asking, John, if that's possible?
If that's possible in the plan.
Yeah.
To play that out.
I will have to find out. I don't know the answer to that one.
Great.
I'll follow up.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's an
Thank
interesting
you.
point, because in seawater intrusion, I also have thought of the idea of triggers and what that would mean. There's no mention of triggers in the GSP regulations, but it's not to say we can't use that for ourselves. You know?
Well, but they do expect some kind of management action, and that could be the management action.
But only up till 2040. Then it's you pass, you fail, or you exceed, you fail.
Other thoughts on this one? Is it a good comment?
This seems fine in light of the fact that we know at this point, this lowest point, we haven't observed it. That's my thought.
You guys ready to go around the room and just weigh in individually?
Go for it.
All right, we're going to start with David this time to get a little bit.
Nothing to add.
You have a thought, your opinion.
Don't ask them that.
Yes or no, thumbs up or down, David.
That's a good one.
Yes, I would definitely, I think it's actually irrelevant. I go with Doug on this one.
Which way?
John.
John.
All good, all in.
I like the trigger. If you can figure out how to add the trigger in, I think it's a great idea.
Good.
Okay. Rich?
Kind of in a quandary. I think I'm good, but I am. We'll stay with I'm good.
You can come back. Dana?
I'm fine with it. Can I just clarify from Kate, are you fine with the staff proposal or the staff proposal with trigger?
Sure.
Okay. And Rich, you
Same.
kind of skipped, okay.
With the trigger. Okay.
Okay.
And Dan?
Yeah, the same thing with the trigger. Great, thank you.
Thank you for that clarification. John?
I'm in favor of the trigger.
I like her, no, sorry. I like the trigger. I'm also okay with the statement as written, given that if we exceed that, even without the trigger, all the other alarms will be ringing massively. So I'm a little bit with Doug that it's irrelevant.
Yeah, so if it has to be dealt with, I would say it should be as a trigger, but I kind of fail to understand the point to finding a historically unrelated metrics and using it as proving that it's never had anything to do with it, and therefore using it as a metrics to measure something.
Right. So uncomfortable with the proxy.
I'm uncomfortable with the proxy that's historically been shown to have nothing to do with what you're measuring for. Yeah, I mean, if you look at it and say, hey, here's a good proxy, it's never had anything to do with it, so we can pretty reliably use it and assume it will never have anything to do with it in the future, that seems to me to be kind of predictive.
It's a negative proxy.
Yeah, I mean, I could choose a lot of things that have never had anything to do with subsidence. Call them a proxy.
It's at that level, it's never had anything to do with it.
No.
What to say if it was 300 feet, if the level
But not to
dropped?
say that it would.
His point is, you actually don't know it has anything to do with it. The sun came up.
Yeah, I mean, what we're saying is that we are not overly subject to it in most of the aquifers anyway. So lots of things have nothing, we don't know that many things have.
But I don't know if that statement's true though, because when we look at like Santa Clara, for example, Santa Clara County, we know that there's a direct correlation between their pumping levels and their groundwater levels and where they did see subsidence, and same in the Central Valley. I know, Mark, you're going to say in our aquifer, and that here we given that we have a more dense aquifer, whatever, that we might not have observed it, and I understand that argument, but generally we know that in these aquifers that groundwater levels and pumping leads to subsidence, there is a correlation, relationship. Here we haven't observed it below these levels. It's not that they never have anything to do with each other. Here we haven't seen a relationship, but generally speaking, as aquifers go, these two are related.
That's okay, you're still choosing levels. In the thing that we are writing here, I'm not saying that there can never be a relationship anywhere in the world. What I'm saying is, you're looking back at history and saying, this happened, it didn't cause anything, so let's say this, and let's say it's okay, and that's just predictive. It's not a measure of anything, it's just a restatement of history. So, but that's okay. For all that, I agree that probably the whole thing is not all that significant because we don't seem to be, affected by it very much. So I'm fine with it, in short. I mean, yeah. But I would just like a caveat, that's all. So that's why I think that a trigger would be better than an instant undesirable result, that's all.
Okay, thank you. John?
So there's a short answer and a long answer.
Which one are we going to get?
If we're going to do this, I like the trigger, but I have two questions. When was the historic low? It wasn't 50 years ago, it was like 20 years ago, right? So it's possible that we can hit that historic low again. You're saying we won't ever hit that. That's my concern.
Well, I guess what I would say, I'm going back to the thing I said earlier about part of the strategy of what happens with this information is it goes into the groundwater model, it looks at historic hydrology, it tells us some things about what's happening, and then it overlays climate change hydrology onto the situation and gives us a sort of sensitivity analysis about, well, how low is that thing? And is that really as low as it will ever go? And when it comes back to you for the next round, you'll have that information that can help you say, maybe we should set this lower.
Yeah, well, that's what I'm saying. So, I mean, if we allow for what that level is to be a dynamic thing that we're going to set later when we have more information, then I'm okay.
And that's
just saying, because Georgina showed me a graph where the thing dipped down to the historic low, not way back there, but up toward the right-hand side of the graph, if I recall correctly.
That's the one that we cannot use a proxy.
That's the TU. Yeah.
So that's the one we're going to put in monitoring, subsidence monitoring for that aquifer. I didn't actually, so that's coming up.
Okay.
Actually, that's the next one.
All right.
We're just talking about the groundwater levels.
Okay, but taking Rosemary's point that if we actually set it based on a more predictive, not to exceed possibility, I'm fine with it.
Well, and again, I just want to say that all of this stuff we're doing this first round is all subject to being readjusted or refined as we understand more of the consequences, but we've got to start someplace.
And the last caveat is, why the heck don't we just tell the state, hey, this doesn't happen here, it's not an issue for us.
I think they got that message.
Yeah. No, but I mean, maybe we're the canary in the mine here, why don't we just take a stand?
Don't forget what happens to Canary.
We pass or we fail, John. We pass or we fail. I think we should shoot for passing.
Yeah.
Doug?
I'm fine.
And Alison?
Yeah, so I think it's fine. I think it's interesting to pursue the trigger. I was actually going to say what John says. Actually, both Johns have said now, Ricker and Kennedy, that while we're setting these, I think it's worth exploring whether or not we have a strong enough argument to say that this just doesn't happen in our basin. I know it's contrary to what I just said. Because the cost of monitoring it might be more difficult than if we've never seen it. We might have a strong enough argument with DWR to just say that we're not susceptible as a basin. I don't know how strong that argument is for us to make, but I think it's at least having a conversation in parallel to us setting these standards. So, just food for thought.
Well, one thing about that, it might be that we could make that case to DWR if we said, we've never seen it, we don't believe we're susceptible, and we understand enough about the relationship of what would cause this to happen, that if we manage based on these other five, the way we're proposing, the likelihood of this thing ever happening are so low as we shouldn't bother to pay attention to it.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a statement, at least pursue that, but I still think we can't can't like variance one and the same,
No,
but then like
not
review
yet.
it later, like you have to keep dealing with it until the DOWR says yes.
I'm trying to put my head in the sand.
Okay, great. So let's move to the other aquifer.
Okay, so with the Persma AA and TU aquifer, we're going to use land surface as elevation as a metric. And here, it needs to be a rate of subsidence and inches PSA occurring in a certain area. So the rate of subsidence, obviously, the higher the rate, the more subsidence you're going to have, but you can more easily avoid undesirable results. The lower rate, lower risk of subsidence. To the extent we're going to focus this on the area, the aquifer of concern. So our statement or our proposal here is that any land subsidence occurring in the area where the Persma AATU unit is being pumped or injected into, because there's that possibility. Groundwater levels are going to go up and down if you're injecting and pumping out of it. If you wanted more flexibility, you could have, which I'm not even going to go into because we've decided that we don't have different subsidence thresholds in different areas, so I won't even talk about that. But so that is really on the western part of the basin where the A and TU is being used, and we would set up land subsidence monitoring for that aquifer, right? Yeah.
So Georgina, why in this one are you talking about injected into? Was that in the other one? I didn't read that. Maybe I wasn't paying attention.
No, it's over here. Right.
I know why you might be including it, but maybe others would like to know.
Well, the reason, we could have easily just said it's being used. That's implied in the other one that those aquifers are used widely throughout the basin. I don't know why it was kind of a bit more specific, but.
I think she's asking, or I would wonder too, like why pumped or is injected into going to cause subsidence? Is shooting water into
No.
Yeah, so that's what, I mean, and it's being pumped, I understand why it's being pumped is in there, but I don't understand why being injected is in there.
Well, I thought perhaps you knew that this is one of the target aquifers for aquifer storage and recovery, which is one of the things at least the city is exploring pretty actively. Or the alternative is some kind of recycled water project that would inject water into the ground, although I'm not sure that in the places where they're talking about putting those injection wells, whether they match up with these two aquifers or not. But definitely the Belts 12 well, which is in these aquifers, is going to, providing we actually have rain next winter, is going to have aquifer storage and recovery pilot tests going on in those wells.
So is that land elevation change instead of land subsidence?
Well, I mean, you could potentially see some of that elastic stuff happening.
But the elastic isn't considered land subsidence. Well,
No,
it's a different kind that we're not dealing with.
Right.
But we also
Be
need to
considered an adverse effect.
Yeah.
No, and the goal is not to fill it up so full that you've got water running out of every hole. Because the goal is to put it in the ground and actually have it be there when you go back and get it later.
So that aquifer is just one that we know is going to have much bigger fluctuations in elevation that we've seen, and we would have to, when we do the modeling and we factor in those projects, then we have to have a look at that range.
But to be clear, injected is also rain and everything. I mean, it's not just what Rosemary said.
No, it is what she's.
So it is.
It's not natural recharge.
No.
It's actual.
Okay.
But I don't know, to be consistent, we probably would need just to say pumped, I think, because that's the thing that's going to cause subsidence.
Or used even, or just.
Yeah, used, yeah.
Okay, other thoughts on this one? So being directly monitored here, unlike in the other aquifer, addressing John's point. You guys ready to just weigh in?
Sure.
Okay. I'm not going to choose. Who wants to go first?
Oh, yeah.
Fine, I'll go.
Thanks, Mark.
Yeah, I'm fine with this technical staff proposal.
Let's go left to John.
I'm fine as well.
Great.
Are we talking about both of those up there as one proposal, or more flexibility?
No, just the top. Yeah, the more flexibility is an option if you want to look for something else. That would give you more flexibility to manage.
I'm good with that proposal.
Okay.
I wanted to check, you're saying you're going to remove the word objection, is that correct?
Yes.
I've modified it too.
Okay. Modification.
I would say any significant land subsidence, but with the addition of that word, I'd be fine.
Let me just tell you the reason why we're not going to include that term, because that would be in the significant and undesirable result. Here we actually have to have a metric, so we would have to come up with a metric that we, in inches per year, that we could add in that. So until we have that, yes.
Okay. And before we go on, just since we started over here, I think several people said that they like the idea of getting rid of injected. Is that true for all the folks who
Yeah,
spoke
or
here?
injected.
I would say pumped out of.
Pumped out of. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Who's next? Alice.
Yeah, I'm fine with the modification of the ending there.
Same.
You just give it
I'm
Me
sorry.
too.
That-
Yeah, you have my proxy.
This is so important.
So I have a question, if I can. So it's an absolute statement that says there can't be any subsidence. So what if, and we think there won't be subsidence, but what if there is subsidence? That is a justification for, because it would be a justification for a state intervention. So in the meantime, we're going to say it justifies a fairly severe management step in order, like it can be used as a justification for management saying, well, because we have this undesirable result, we need to take extraordinary steps to address it. Is that correct?
Until 2040, you would tell us that we need to stop pumping there, or we need to do something.
can't go
Well, it could, or say we have to, management can say, we are now, this is sort of a thing saying that we have to address this and we can address it fairly aggressively because otherwise it's a problem.
Right.
Okay, I'm fine with it. I'm just asking.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. All right, so we're going to move to, actually, we're going to do public comment. Again, at this point, we wanted to pause here and invite the public in particular to weigh in on the discussion we just had here on subsidence, or if there are other topics on the agenda you'd like to weigh in on as well, that would be good. So I'd love to see a show of hands of people who would like to participate here. 1 and 2. Okay, great. So if you guys could come up and give your name and affiliation code. And you'll each have 3 minutes.
My name is Catherine Borelman, and I'm a water resources consultant. I just wanted to provide a little bit of information about the recycled water study that Rosemary Menard just mentioned. So the proposed sites for the injection in the recycled water study are close to to Belts 12 and to the well 22, which is in that area of the TU. So just you asked that for that clarification. That's it.
Thank you. Thank you, Catherine.
Hi, Larry Freeman. See, I was thinking about 2 things. One was with the proxy, the groundwater level proxy, and using the historic low. And you said you wanted an annual average. And I just think that should be narrowed down to like either monthly or quarterly, because by the time you have had compaction or low groundwater levels that might cause compaction for a year, it's too late. You already lost that aquifer storage. Yeah, I did a lot of work down at Edwards Air Force Base on land subsidence and aquifer compaction. When I was with USGS, whole different story there. They had cracks, fissures, lake beds tilting, and all kinds of stuff. So it was pretty obvious, but I would think that you would want to know sooner than an average annual and act sooner. And then the other thing is about think that you wouldn't want to allow any subsidence that causes a reduction in your aquifer storage capacity or in damage to infrastructure. Those are the key things, you know. So especially if you've got pipelines running, and if it's differential subsidence, things are starting to tilt or crack. You saw that on your example with the surface water canal, which we don't have any around right now. But those are the kind of things I would think should be considered in that too. That's it.
Okay, thank you, Larry. And thank you, Catherine. All right, we're going to move to our last agenda item, which is taking a look back on our last meeting. And the first thing we wanted to do is to just confirm the meeting summary for the April 25th meeting that went out with your packet. Would like to hear if there are any comments or issues that folks had with that before we move it on to the MGA. Okay, so hearing none, we will then move that on to the MGA for approval. And the last topic has to do with essentially like what is staff doing with the input you gave here. So we had a similar discussion last month on this on the topic of seawater intrusion, and what staff did was to hear all that and actually came out with some revised staff proposal for, I think, all 7 of the different topics that we examined at the last meeting, and drawing from that saying, you know, if we use these, especially these new undesirable results, we propose here are the minimum thresholds that necessarily just come out of that. And so what we wanted to do today is really check in with you on, we didn't want to spend 2 hours at the beginning of the meeting saying, did we nail it? Because we wanted to make sure we get through this discussion first. But we want to check in with you now and say, are we close to any red flags? Did we misinterpret or misrepresent in some way, in a significant way, what we heard before? And is the way that was represented to you in this document that basically said, here is the proposal, here's what we heard, here's how we're proposing to change the staff proposal for both significant and unreasonable conditions and undesirable results, and here's the rationale for this new technical staff proposal. And if everyone's okay with that, then here are the...
Clarify, and you're talking about agenda item 8.2, right?
Yes, thank you. Agenda item 8.2.
Insert on page 74 of 90 in the packet.
As you'll notice, I think almost all of the initial staff proposals actually were modified in some way based upon what we heard from the advisory, ways that staff thought were good modifications. They were improvements, exactly how we're hoping this process works.
And I think it's reasonable if people don't feel like they've had a chance to really look at it enough and compare the minutes with this item, which I think do correlate pretty well. You can always email me if you have some, corrections or discomfort. And remembering too that we're going to be revisiting this as we go through the process. This is just the beginning of the iterative process.
Yeah, so we wanted to essentially give you all a week if you want to spend more time just making sure that you're comfortable with that. We would love to, if you do have any additional comments on that, we would take them by the 30th.
I think we'd be open to hearing from you whenever we hear from you.
We can have that as a target date, and if you need more time, just let us know.
This is a really nice thing to see. That's what I'd say about it.
Yeah, it makes sense to you?
Whether it makes sense in every specific point or not, it's nice to see that you're listening to what we're saying and revising as best you can to your understanding of us, as opposed to just listening to what we're saying and then saying, it all seemed like they were happy with what we did.
Well, obviously you weren't all happy with it.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Well, but I'm just saying, at least for me, I appreciate it. Yeah.
So I did, in the spirit of Doug Lay, sort of just sped over Georgina's presentation here. Is there
I don't want to make a big deal of it, but I do want to share with you something new. That you know, most of you were at the last meeting. But what is new here? Well, maybe I can, you know, how are we using what we're discussing at this meeting? So, you know, we're making a statement of significant unreasonable. We're talking about undesirable results, and out of that, if you notice, there's always a metric, a number that's involved in the undesirable result, and that becomes a measurable objective. And there is that chart that you see there, and we actually have some on boards as well, because we realized at the last meeting too, you know, we were, at one of the meetings, we were always talking about this low bar, but there's also a high bar. And so we just wanted to remind you about this. This comes from one of DWR's documents, that for each of the 6 sustainability indicators, we come up with a minimum threshold. And this comes out of the undesirable result. Okay, and then anything below that is significant unreasonable. What we're also going to do is have something else, this measurable objective, where we'd really like the basin to be. Because what happens, we need some operational flexibility. We don't want to be operating down here and have a big old drought, and then we go below and we're unsustainable. So really how the basin will be managed is that we will operate at a higher level, of course. And this is extreme. That's how it's set up to be. But, you know, and maybe it was my fault that I didn't talk about measurable. Well, you did actually hear from Derek about measurable objectives, but I was trying to just keep the terminology limited per meeting because it was a lot. But you guys are just about understand everything now, so I'm going to say measurable objective finally. And I feel so much better now. And anyway, then there's these interim milestones that happen, and again, you know, we give these 5-year reports to DWR. They have a look. As Bruce was saying, and they'll have a look and say, are you on the path to, they don't judge you on this, they judge you on whether you go below the minimum threshold. So, but this here is for our operational flexibility and our being able to sleep at night, knowing that, you know, we're not going to fail. Okay, so that's why, you know, all this discussion is just informing us, letting us come up with these minimum thresholds that we would put use in the model. You know, we run the model, various things we would change, climate, projects, whatever. We have a look at those key wells we selected as representative monitoring wells. Are we reaching those levels that we would like to see? And, you know, if the projects are good enough, we're going to be way above those minimum levels, so that would be great. So now with seawater intrusion, DWR requires the minimum threshold for seawater intrusion is this ISO contour. And I've talked to you about that before. You've seen various versions of this. And now this is one I've drawn, given the information we got back from you at the last meeting about certain wells being 250 milligrams per liter. And we're drawing this ISO contour through the wells, because then we have a control point on the ISO contour. If we drew that contour between wells, well, how do you know? You know, so I very purposely have drawn it through those wells. It goes inland. The red line is Parissima ISO contour, and it goes inland. Actually, it's Seascape. This well in here has got it. And then down here is just a little ISO contour for Aromas. There's only that one well in the basin that's impacted. There are wells in Pajaro that are also impacted. But that's what we have. And then if you read that document, I've proposed having kind of these trigger wells. Any other well, production or monitoring well, that has a level of 150 milligrams per liter. And that number is selected because Soquel Creek Water District and the city kind of operate on that number too in their internal management of seawater intrusion. So we would apply that and then to those kind of more inland wells. That was one of the proposed, or that was a recommendation that we got from you to use those other wells as well. So that's what that would look like. But when we do the modeling, we don't have a groundwater quality model that is going to tell us if we're achieving this. So that's why we have protective elevations that we can model. We can model groundwater levels. That's what the model is, a groundwater flow model. And so these are the protective elevations that are currently established for 12 wells, I think, along the coast there. You saw those orange dots. And these would be minimum thresholds. We would establish higher levels for measurable objectives. Right. Yeah. So that's, those would be proxies. Again, those would be elevations and proxy for this, and we, for chloride concentration, and we would use both of those kind of together.
Okay. Yeah, so this is all described in greater detail in the document that was in the packet. So yeah, so questions about this. So we'll do Kate and then John.
Quickly, in terms of the question about is this a helpful format in terms of moving forward, I think it's really helpful. And for me, it really helps synthesize the variety of comments that were made by the members of our committee in terms of staff moving forward with it, and I appreciate it.
Thanks.
Regina, thank you for getting to what you call a measurable objective. A couple meetings ago, I was very nervous because all this sort of low bar stuff.
Yeah.
And maybe how I would characterize it is the difference between perspiration, sweating it out, and aspiration. And I'm glad we're going to kind of have our eye on it, what we're aspiring to. Given the uncertainty of the future, given the uncertainty of climate change and all of that. Thank you for getting there. I can sleep better tonight.
Thanks, John. So again, any other thoughts either on the format, or if you did get to read the document in detail, did staff more or less hit the mark in terms of incorporating? See a couple nodding heads. So I propose, just because I just want to invite everybody else, if you didn't feel like you were able to go into that in detail enough, please follow up after the meeting and do so. And we'd love to get any comments you have within the week. If you need more time, let us know. And just, should those go to you, Darcy?
Yeah, I think coming to me and like consensus and share.
Okay, but I think what's nice to see though is that there were minimum thresholds that came out of that discussion we had last week on that one sustainability indicator. And at next month, you'll in your packet have two similar documents for the other two sustainability indicators that we did this time. So hopefully these will look familiar. And again, please look at those and say, yeah, you know, because especially in the last meeting, at times there were folks who were a little all over the map on things, and so we tried to hit an area of saying, this is what we heard the most of that seems like a reasonable way from the technical staff perspective to move forward given the input we got from the advisory committee. Okay, so...
Ballots returned.
Excuse me?
Ballots returned.
Ballots. Do we have ballots?
I passed them out. I have a few of them back. I would love to have everybody's
Yeah,
ballots
if you could raise
back.
your hand. So while I'm wrapping up here, just a couple reminders. So again, the next meeting we'll be doing two other sustainability indicators. There'll be water quality and surface water interactions. We'll be doing a similar format again, and so thank you for your contributions today. The July meeting again is the joint meeting, and what I want to let everybody know, because this is new, that this is our last meeting here at the Sheriff's Station. So starting in June, and I think for the rest of our time,
for the rest of this year.
For the rest of this year, we'll be at the Simpkins Family Swim Center. And we'll be starting a little bit earlier. We have earlier access around 5 o'clock is our
we'll start at 5.
aspiration. Okay.
And people know that the July meeting is on July 19th, right? It's not on the
25th. Right?
Yeah, the original date of this would have been the fourth Wednesday.
Right. And so that meeting's not going to happen. We're only doing the 19th, and we will not have the meeting on the fourth Wednesday in July, and we'll return to that in August.
Right.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so yeah, I think these were the key things you wanted to mention there. Again, we'll be starting in July looking at management actions and starting to talk about modeling around that, and then bringing in some trend data. So I think that's it. Any final notes from executive team members or from members of the advisory committee?
Thank you all. You guys are doing splendid. Thank you.
Oh, good. Okay. Thank you, everybody. We are adjourned.